Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very accomplished professional from North Carolina, USA, Ann Louden. Ann, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
Thank you. Ann is a nonprofit consultant. She's an author. She's a strategic planning and board governance training advisor and has been nationally recognized as a speaker. She's a fundraising campaign expert. She's also the spokesperson for the Adoption and Cancer Causes nonprofit board leader, and she has an upcoming book, Who Do I Meet Next? Leadership Lessons on How to Be an Unforgettable Connector. So, Anne, just before we started, you were telling me about that you were in Texas and now you have moved to the northern part of the US. Tell me about your own amazing journey in brief.
Oh, thank you for the opportunity to do that. Well, I grew up in the South in the US, and but in my early 20s I moved to Texas, which is where my career started and really where the bulk of it occurred in higher education. I was in fundraising and community partnerships and loved the experience of being on a team, a really big team in
Mm,
a university setting where I got to interact with students and had an opportunity to make really lifelong friendships.
mm,
And we'll talk more about connection in a
yep.
bit, but that was where the seed was planted in that environment. And then I moved right before COVID to New York City, which is my favorite city in the U.S. I had always wanted to live there, and I had that dream come true, interrupted a bit by the pandemic towards the end of my time there,
Mm,
and then moved to
mm,
North Carolina. In all that journey, I mentioned that my professional career, and thank you for the recitation of the things that I've been involved in.
mm,
I I really have loved being in vibrant nonprofit communities, and New
mm.
York City provides that. And in my own community in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, which is a university town,
Yep.
there's a lot of interest in giving back. And so that feels right to me to be in both places. But
Mm,
I would say that that one of the biggest pieces of my life that changed my life was having cancer.
mm,
And that was now 17 years ago. Hard to believe. But at the time, it was scary. And
yep.
yet I was able to use that to mobilize large group of cancer survivors to raise money for cancer research, and did that for 12 years,
Mm,
in addition to what I was already doing for my
wow.
work and professional role.
Mm,
And I loved that experience. It got me connected to people I would never have met,
mm,
and it helped me help them. And so that's probably one of the most defining moments of my life.
mm. Amazing. Thank you for sharing this for me. So, and we're going to talk a little bit about building long lasting and effective connections. You are an expert in this area. And my first question is, how do you define a long lasting and effective communication, a connection in both personal and professional settings?
Well, I think they are similar. The first thing that I would say when you reference long lasting, and I think about people that you connect with,
Mm,
your intention needs to be that you are going to maintain that relationship for more than just a passing moment. So the
mm,
first piece of professional and personal connections is the length of time that you're investing in them. The second is mutual support. So, what you're looking for is an opportunity to build a relationship with someone that you care about, either personally or professionally, and
mm,
that they care about you. I think the third piece of a really authentic connection is your curiosity and investment in the other person's life, whether that's a
mm,
professional setting or it's a personal setting. And I have found that the tactics and the skills that we employ to
mm,
be effective connectors work in both settings, and we can
mm.
explore that further. But that's a
Yeah,
great question. Thank you.
thank you. And what would you say are some of the key strategies you use to build meaningful relationships with people from different walks of life?
I think there are three critical strategies that all of us as connectors need to employ. The
Mm,
first is to ask questions.
mm,
To get to know the other person, we have to be able to probe and to be interested in and curious about their lives,
mm,
whether again it's in a professional or personal setting.
mm,
And then the second part of that is we need to listen and remember.
mm,
One of my, I mentioned that I was in higher education and fundraising, and one of
mm.
my secrets for how to remember is that I take copious notes. And
Yeah.
I'm not doing that right now with you, but if you and I were on a Zoom call and it was an introductory call,
Mm,
and you told me about your life and your professional experience, I would have so many notes that I would have taken. And I do this by hand. Sometimes I
mm,
record things, but more typically, I'm writing notes.
mm.
And then when you and I pick up the pieces in the next visit or the next setting, I can reference what we talked about. And I think that's so meaningful for people to be listened to be heard. So
Absolutely.
the first is to ask questions. The second would be to remember
Mm,
what you've heard,
mm.
listen carefully to
Yeah.
what the other person is saying. Don't anticipate what they're saying so that you can have an answer ready. And the third is to really be present, to be
Mm,
in the moment, not to be somewhere else in your head, not to be thinking about the next meeting or event, but you're there in this moment, experiencing it to the fullest, whatever that represents.
mm.
And that I think is probably the most important strategy. We are all so busy and we're pulled away both physically and mentally from what we're doing at this present time. And
Correct.
that distraction takes away from the ability to build good connections.
Great response. Thank you. And how important is authenticity in forming connections? And how can one maintain one's authenticity in today's incredibly fast-paced world?
It's so difficult. Well, first of all, I'll answer the first part of your question.
Yeah.
How important is it to be authentic? Well, I think if you don't present yourself in a vulnerable way, you miss the opportunity to understand the other person, to understand who they are and where they come from. And to do that, you've got to share a piece of your life. I just told you I'm a cancer survivor.
Mm,
That's something I wouldn't necessarily have to have told you, but
mm.
but it did shape my life, and that's
Yeah.
part of my authentic story. And so I believe it's critical that we share something of ourselves,
Mm,
which shows our vulnerability. No one is perfect, and what
right.
makes us most interesting is the challenge and the transitions we've gone through and overcome, because that's where the
Mm,
lessons are.
mm,
So it's so important. It's one of the most important pieces of building a connection that's really genuine and will last for a long time.
mm,
And then how do we do it in today's ever crowded world with all the pressures we face?
mm.
And particularly in the US, we've just been through a really traumatic election.
Yeah.
And people are exhausted and worn out, and they don't know how to react to each other at this point.
Mm,
And so I think that's where authenticity is going to help us. It's going to heal us, and that we can be who we are without fear of retribution, with belief that other people will be tolerant of our points of views. I
mm,
hope I'm right about that.
mhm.
But I think that's important too, is to recognize where the other person is
Right.
in the place where you are building a connection.
Wow. Great response. My next question for you, Anne, is that, and you are a nonprofit consultant. How can nonprofits effectively engage their stakeholders to build long-lasting connections that support their own mission?
I love that question because one of the challenges for nonprofits is to get the attention of
Absolutely.
their clientele, their constituency,
Mm,
in what you just described, this crazy madness that we're all
mm,
going through.
mm,
And particularly now, there's so many ways to contact constituents of an organization,
mm,
everything from texting to, a barrage of email, and still the term direct mail, which means the mail that arrives in your mailbox. There,
mm.
that's another way.
Yeah.
To stage events. All those are ways that we as representatives of nonprofits reach out to our base, our donor
Mm,
base. I think there are three really significant ways nonprofits can make you and me feel engaged when we're
Mhm.
supporting an organization. The
Right.
first is communication. I cannot overstate that enough. And I'm not talking about group communication. I'm talking about one-to-one communication.
Yeah.
So if you know someone in the nonprofit that you care about and support financially,
Mhm.
and that person knows you and knows your name and knows who you are and knows your story and knows why you care about the organization, that goes a long way to building the connection because the connections is with the cause, but it's really with the person representing the cause.
Mm.
I always say to staff who work for a nonprofit, you are the nonprofit. You
Right.
are the face of the nonprofit.
Mm.
And if you can build a relationship with you, then the relationship with the nonprofit gets stronger.
Mm.
Right now, I have a client that I'm working with to complete a $25 million fundraising goal.
Mm.
And as I connect with donors that have supported the nonprofit, I always ask, so tell me the story of how you got started in believing in blank cause
Mhm.
and that opens the door. I get to hear their interaction with our staff or their
Mm.
visit to the physical location or something meaningful about the nonprofit in their lives or a story that represents the cause of someone that they knew and cared about. And so I think that communication, the building the relationship is really key. The second piece is gratitude. We often teach when we ask about we teach people how to raise money. We say
Mm.
there are seven thank yous that need to happen before you ask for that next gift.
Wow.
Seven.
Okay.
There are countless ways to say thank you, and that would be another conversation. But we can't move from that. Thanks for your gift. How about another one?
Mm.
So that sense of gratitude and appreciation and recognition that someone cared enough about your cause to take money from assets
Mm.
or however they decided to fund what you asked them to fund, and they're doing that maybe once a month, maybe every year, maybe they're stepping up for some big effort, some campaign that you're working on.
Mm.
So the gratitude piece is really important. And then there's a third, which may surprise you, and that is
Mm.
that if you ask for advice or feedback and get them engaged, you have such a better chance
Yeah.
of keeping them interested in supporting the cause.
Incredible. Thank you. And how can one transition a professional connection into a personal friendship without crossing boundaries?
Oh, that's a good question. I've done it so many times, and I
Sure.
don't think I've crossed a boundary, but let me think about that for a minute. Well, first of all, I think there's a natural inclination
Mm.
to build from a professional relationship a personal one if there's chemistry, personal chemistry,
Yeah.
if there's a genuine likability about the two people and that matches their personalities. It doesn't
Mm.
always
Mm.
happen. Um, and if there's I said earlier the curiosity and the
Mm.
investment in a relationship that carries on. So I don't know what the percentage is. I've never thought about the numbers,
Mm.
but let's say maybe, a quarter of the professional relationships we have become also personal relationships
Mm.
that transcend that professional connection. So crossing the boundary suggests to me something about confidentiality. Maybe
Mm.
there's a piece of the relationship related to the work setting that needs to be confidential.
Mm.
But I think we treat all of our friendships, whether professional or personal, in a
Mm.
confidential way. We shouldn't share what's shared with us that is for us. It's
Correct.
not for the world to know.
Yeah.
And so that would be crossing a boundary for certain.
Mm.
Talking about information you glean from a personal relationship that's also professional in a workplace setting where that information shouldn't be divulged would
Mm.
also be
Yeah.
crossing a boundary.
Mm.
I'm sure there are situational
Mm.
occasions where I would be able to say to myself, I shouldn't go there because it's the
Mm.
wrong thing.
Correct.
There used to be a notion that if you were in a fundraising role and someone made you a gift, for example, you got to go on a trip or
Mm.
something related to that,
Yeah.
and it felt as if you were taking advantage. So I just think our antenna need to be up with thinking about, are we taking an unfair advantage because
Mm.
of this personal relationship that's also professional?
Mm.
If it needs to be squeaky clean to the world, and I think
Absolutely.
you're going to be
Yes.
okay.
Yes. That goes without saying. Absolutely. So, two more questions relating to connections, and I want to move to your forthcoming book. How has social media impacted building connections?
Well, you and I are on social media.
Absolutely.
We broadcast our brand on
Mm.
social media,
Yeah.
so it's a part of that messaging to the world
Mm.
of who we are, but it's very surface. There's not a way that you and I can get to know each other on social
Mm.
media. In
Yeah.
fact, the first thing we want to do if we want to get connected is to get off social media and build that relationship in
Yeah.
another way.
Mm.
Social media, particularly for young people, I think is dangerous. I think it does not foster connections. It fosters a semblance of what is a connection, but doesn't
Correct.
teach
Mm.
all the things that you and I are talking about.
Mm.
Likes aren't equivalent on a social media post to
Mm.
friendships or to even the beginning of connections. They're just
Mm.
simply a technique that we use to acknowledge that we've read something. And I
Mm.
think people give them way too much weight in terms
Mm.
of the value they have in their lives. It's not about there is no value to social media and building connections.
Mm.
What it builds, I think, are links to other people through a communication that we all like or care about. But
Mm.
it's not a relationship
Correct.
because that's the basis of a connection.
Great response. And what advice would you give to someone who is naturally introverted and struggles with initiating a connection?
Well, that's a question I do get asked a lot.
Mm.
People say, "Oh, it's easy for you. You're an extrovert.
Yeah.
You can connect with anybody." Well,
Mm.
first of all, as a very shy child,
Mm.
terrified. We don't come out of the womb being a connector. We don't have
Absolutely.
the ability.
Mm.
We hide behind our mother's skirts when
Yeah.
we're children, and
Yeah.
some people prefer and are very much loners and prefer not to engage with others. So
Mm.
I think to be a connector and to have connections is
Mm.
essential for our well-being, our
Mm.
lifetime well-being, both professionally and personally. And I don't mean just romantic relationships personally.
Mm.
I
Yeah.
mean friendships
Mm.
that can be there to provide support. So
Absolutely.
I don't know how you get through life really without that network of support.
Correct.
So back to the introvert. Remember that connections are made one to one, and the
Mm.
introvert has an advantage
Mm.
really over the extrovert who might walk into a room filled with 200 people and flip from one person to another and be
Mm.
perfectly comfortable, and the introvert would be out of their skin, miserable.
Mm.
But all we must do when we build connections is to build that deeper conversation
Mm.
with one person at a time. I can't walk into a group of four people and
Mm.
be connected to all of them.
Mm.
I can single one person out and take it to the next level. But
Mm.
introverts have no disadvantage there. They're very good one to one.
Correct. Well said.
That's their strength.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're so right. I mean, we can't go through life without having connections. That's so important for all of us. Uh,
Absolutely.
and want to move now to your forthcoming book, Who Do I Meet Next? Leadership Lessons on How to Be an Unforgettable Connector. When is this book scheduled for release?
Well, I hope sometime at the end of 2025, but it
Okay.
could be 2026. If you're the author of 9 books, so you know that the time frame between
1
writing and
year.
publishing and
Yeah.
marketing and all that is lengthy.
Okay.
I started interviewing the 20 leaders around the country during
Mm.
COVID,
Mm.
and that was not. I wanted to be in front of everybody, so
Mm.
there are some updates that I want to do with the people that I interviewed.
Mm.
But the reason reason that I thought about writing a book about being a connector is because I have a great colleague, a good example of a professional relationship that became also a personal one,
Mm,
who's in Greenwich, Connecticut. And he's written several books about connection culture,
mm,
about the environment in a workplace setting where employees thrive. And so he and I have spent quite a bit of time talking about that concept. And
mm,
he had said to me, you know, you need to write a book about the skills that connectors need. It's a different concept than the
mm,
workplace culture that's a connection culture. But in particular, you know, who are the leaders that embrace the idea of being connectors in their professional environment?
mm,
So my thought was if I took that concept and talked about what are the strategies to be a good connector, and
mm,
that would extend to your family, to your workplace,
mm,
you know, to your community. So it'd be broader conversation than just workplace. The
mm,
people that I have interviewed are people that are absolutely renowned for their ability to build that connection culture in the workplace, but they are connectors themselves and committed to it.
mm. And in these 20 people who you've spoke to, were there any surprising insights you learned? I'm not sure if you can speak about it before your book release, but if you can't, just say so.
Well, one of the interesting things I learned, and it probably was the way I structured the interviews, because I began with the question, who in your life has been a connector,
Mm,
and who are your role models for you to
mm,
be a connector? And
mm,
I learned that without exception, these 20 people had others they looked up to that were role models, and they had if not copied, they'd at least observed and learned what
mm,
the role models did to build these relationships.
mm,
I thought that was interesting because I didn't really expect that that was going to be what I would hear.
mm,
I think a second point that I actually appreciate because it's how I approach this too,
mm,
but a lot of the interviewees said the same thing, and that is
mm,
they think of connecting as a second job. That it can't be just occasional. It can't be something that happens over the transom. It has to be planned for. One of the people that I interviewed, that actually I'm so excited I'm going to be seeing him on Sunday
mhm,
in Washington, D.C. It just happened that and I haven't seen him since COVID. So that shows
mhm.
you how long this book has been in process.
Yeah.
Um, he has a spreadsheet and he has a list of the 50 most important people in his life. And he actually catalogs and plans when he needs to be in touch with these people in order to keep this regular communication going.
Mm,
I thought
mm.
that was pretty brilliant. You
Yeah.
know, I'm not focused on an Excel spreadsheet for remembering that I need to connect with people, but
Mhm.
I've done things like put on my calendar to repeat that I need to check on somebody who's having surgery
Yeah.
and keep checking on them. So I think the idea of planning and thinking of it as your second job and saying, how many people am I going to connect with in a month? What is your goal?
Mm,
So I think that's interesting. And then the third point I would make that I heard from people over and over again
mm,
is that being a connector requires saying yes,
mm,
and sometimes more than you want to say yes.
mm,
Somebody contacts you and wants to have a conversation about your particular field of interest or your professional expertise. And you think, oh my gosh, I'm so busy. I don't have
mm,
time. But I try so hard to say yes because I want to know something about the person who wants to be connected to me.
mm.
And sometimes those relationships go somewhere. But if I can help them, even with one suggestion or one introduction, I will have done what I feel is appropriate to do.
Amazing. I'm going to ask you one more question, and I would have loved to talk much more about your book, but I understand it's scheduled for release a year away. So closer to the date of your launch, we will talk. We'll schedule another conversation, and we'll speak only about your book. But my last question to you for today is, what do you hope readers will take away from your book, especially in terms of their own leadership and building connections?
Thank you for that question. I hope that once people have read the book, they're inspired to be they're validated and inspired to be committed to being connectors. I hope that they come away feeling like they've heard stories that are real lessons that make them want to build out relationships that maybe they were hesitant to build out before.
Mm.
I also want to provide tactical skill sets in describing them that work for people to be connectors. You can connect at any level you want
Yeah.
and as frequently as you want. But a lot of people are afraid. They're scared of rejection. If somebody wanted to meet you and were afraid to know how to approach that
Hmm.
conversation, I want to provide the steps to help people feel that it's a great adventure to be a
Mm.
connector. It's not, there should be no fear involved, but yet it's a natural reaction. And
Mm.
then I also want people to understand and plan for the time it takes to be a connector because you do have an investment to make of your own energy and your time and your priorities. So I hope that they will gain all that. And then I hope it's going to be a fun read. The
I'm
20 people I
sure.
interviewed are really interesting and amazing people in their own lives.
Absolutely. I'm sure. And I'm going to look out for it, and get a copy for myself. But on that note, Anne, I just want to say thank you so much for speaking to me. You have such a vast body of work that you have done that I think in my conversation with you today, we were only able to cover two areas, which is effective connections and a little bit about your book. But there's so much more about fundraising, which you are an expert in. And there's another completely new aspect, which we didn't even touch upon, which is on board governance. Thank
Right,
you for
right.
talking to me about different aspects of connections, which included long lasting and effective connections, building meaningful relationships, importance of authenticity. I love the way you told me about the seven thank yous when it comes to fundraising. We spoke a little bit about social media. You also talked a little bit about how a naturally introverted person could build connections. I do want to repeat the three suggestions, the 3 points you gave me for meaningful relationships for our viewers and listeners, which is to ask questions, listen and remember, and be present. On that note, thank you again for speaking to me, Anne, and all the very best to you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the brand called You.